bit that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland.
Breaking right now, there is a growing war on the right over the legacy of Winston Churchill, Britain's greatest prime minister ever, the man who changed us post-war, or a warmonger. This conversation has gone up a level after Tucker Carlson's interview with, again, someone called Darryl Cooper, who on one hand is described as one of the most important historians in the world today, on the other, a Holocaust apologist. Watch this.
And I'm American. I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to, they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland.
So today I want to decode those claims with Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, who is a historian and also a major supporter of Winston Churchill, in part because he wrote recently that in World War II, his relatives were murdered by both the Nazis and communists. His father is Sikh, his mother is Polish. His family came to Britain in the 1940s as part of the Polish government in exile. So, Rafe, it used to be the hard left that questioned Winston Churchill's legacy, but now it is folk on the right, including people who I have great respect for, like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. You're very angry about this, aren't you?
I am, and I think it's historical illiteracy of the greatest kind, and that's to put it mildly. Either people are being deliberately dim or disingenuous. I wrote my master's thesis on Winston Churchill. I served on the board of the International Churchill Society. I was honored to join Mo Molim for the final of BBC's Great Britain's on Team Churchill in 2020. I've been studying the man for 30 years, and no respected Churchill historian, no one who actually knows the subject, would support any of this nonsense. And I was amused to hear you refer to this chap, Darryl Cooper, as a renowned world historian. As far as I can see, the man never studied history in his life. He doesn't have a degree in history. He's clearly not trained in any historical skills that any academic would regard as being legitimate to actually come out with such outlandish statements. It seems that his knowledge is simply cursory, based upon reading other people's books rather than doing what any decent historian does, and that's to go to the primary sources, to go to the Churchill archives and so forth. And anybody who has even the most, slight knowledge of Churchill in the Second World War can clearly see that this man wasn't responsible for the Second World War. For heaven's sake, he spent years in the wilderness warning the world about the threat from Nazism and so forth. But there are very few occasions in history, this is perhaps the only occasion in history, where the future of the Western world and the future of the free world rested upon one man's shoulder. There's that old expression, cometh the hour, cometh the man. I don't think it was ever more relevant. And the reason I say that is because for 1 year, Britain, along with its empire, but Britain in terms of the continent of Europe, stood alone against Nazism, from the fall of France and Dunkirk in May-June 1940, right through to Operation Barbarossa when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. And for that year, resources were so slender that Britain was on the verge of defeat. And it was only Winston Churchill's iron will, resolute determination and spirit and his masterful skill of oratory that kept Britain in the war. And if Britain had succumbed, if there had been another prime minister, which is one of the issues that this chap Darryl Cooper says, if someone like Lord Halifax or Lord Holyfox, as he's known, had become prime minister and sued for peace, there's no guarantee that Hitler would have recognized that peace treaty. Hitler tore up every treaty he signed, and there's this bizarre idea by some on the sort of on the deranged right, like this man, that Hitler would have somehow, above all other treaties, this one he would have adhered to. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, let's have a look at that argument, actually, Rafe, because I want to show you what Darryl Cooper specifically said about this to Tucker Carlson, and then you can respond.
And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this is what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. We don't.
So, Rafe, is it true that Hitler was looking for peace after the start of the war and he was spurned by Churchill?
Von Ribbentrop, who was Hitler's ambassador over here, certainly had approached that idea with the government. But of course, it wasn't a concerted effort. It wasn't an ongoing move by Hitler to try to get peace done. And this is where actually platforms like X and Twitter is very useful, because this chap, Darryl Cooper, has written a whole thread making all of these arguments. And Elon Musk's wonderful thing called community notes is where you can actually challenge legitimate misinformation. That's why you don't need to have a clampdown on X, because community notes provides that important function of allowing people to make up their own mind about what is misinformation or not. For example, Darryl Cooper says that Hitler sent Rudolf Hess to Britain to negotiate in parley for some sort of terms. Complete nonsense. Rudolf Hess came here on his own initiative and without any sanction from Hitler. I mean, this is sort of second-rate sort of history. And let's understand what he's saying here. If Hitler had defeated Britain, or if he had got a peace treaty with Britain, Hitler would have attained complete domination of the continent of Europe. And he would have been able to actually focus 100% of his force against Russia, as opposed to the 70% that actually was spent against Russia in the Second World War. And after the war, Joseph Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev both said that if Germany had given them 100% of their force, if it was a simple one-on-one war, single front war, then Germany would have won. And if Germany had won, that means that Hitler would have controlled Europe and Russia and Africa and Asia with Japan. And of course, once it restored its forces, it would inevitably have come to attack Britain, because Hitler had always got Napoleon in his mind, and Napoleon was never able to conquer all of Europe, was never able to conquer Britain. And for Hitler's legacy to be greater than Napoleon, greater than Julius Caesar, there is no doubt in my mind that the man who always tore up treaties would tear up this treaty. Because another important thing to remember, Hitler didn't love or like Britain. He admired Britain. He admired Britain. He admired the way that we got our empire. But he wasn't a romantic and didn't have any idea of, the Anglo-Saxons being somehow our brothers and we must join together. This was a man who wanted to dominate and conquer. And if he had conquered Europe and Britain and Africa and Asia, he would then have been able to turn his attention on North America. That's why Franklin Roosevelt said in his Arsenals of Democracy speak, if Great Britain goes down, the peoples of America will be living at the point of a gun. And actually, it was British scientists who helped the American Manhattan Project for a nuclear weapon. If Hitler had actually taken control of Britain, it's very much likely that actually Germany could have used British scientists to get them towards the nuclear stage too. And all the time that we're talking about, having peace with Hitler, the peoples of Europe, not just the Jews, but the Slavs and the peoples of France and Denmark and the Netherlands and so forth, would all have been subjugated under the Nazi jackboot, as Hitler had free rein to also embark on his murderous policy against the Slavs and the Jews as well. To be so morally bankrupt as to think that peace with Hitler was an obvious way to go, I think is just reprehensible.
But all right, guys, it is the best time of year because football is back. We're talking Premier League in the UK, in the US, NFL Sundays and college football Saturdays. And with that comes the glorious grind of fantasy football lineup. So this is where your inner manager comes alive, setting the perfect fantasy roster, screaming at your TV and making last-minute waiver moves that either make you a hero or the guy everyone ridicules in the group chat. But listen, while you're over there making sure your fantasy team is dialed in, don't let your personal grooming become the guy that gets left on the bench. Let's be honest, nobody wants to fumble their grooming routine, and that's where Manscaped's Performance Package 5.0 Ultra comes in, acting as your all-in-one grooming playbook. From keeping things sharp down below with the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra to taking care of those rogue nose and ear hairs with the Weed Whacker 2.0, this is the lineup that'll keep you looking and feeling like a champ on and off the field. It will help you feel clean, confident, and ready to dominate your fantasy league. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra Groin and Body Hair Trimmer is the franchise player of your grooming roster with precise trimming capabilities. It's reliable, efficient, and gets the job done without fumbling. Whether it's for date night, a weekend tailgate, or just everyday grooming, this is the tool you want on your squad. No one wants a surprise nose or ear hair making a guest appearance on the game day. That's why the Weed Whacker 2.0 handles those details like a pro, keeping you neat and ready to go. No missed tackles in your grooming gang. And the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra doesn't stop at grooming and essentials. It also comes with 2 free gifts: the Boxers 2.0 Midnight Bravo and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag. Premium gear to ensure you're always ready for action, whether at home or on the road. Join the over 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped and get ready for kickoff by heading over to manscaped.com. Use the code OUTSPOKEN for 20% off and free shipping. Trust me, you'll be drafting the real MVP of grooming this season. www.manscaped.com. Use the code OUTSPOKEN at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. Stay on top of your grooming gang and be ready for anything this season throws your way. There are 3 other key areas where Churchill is specifically criticised, and it would be great if you could decode them or debunk them depending on how you feel. And I think the key areas, Rafe, are Churchill and the Bengal famine, Churchill and poison gas, and Churchill sending in tanks to crush the general strike. So do you think it is fair for him to be criticised in those areas?
Absolutely not. I mean, the Churchill and the Bengal famine, this only came up actually in the last couple of decades. There was a historian there was a woman called Mukherjee, I won't call her a historian, who has been completely deconstructed and her arguments destroyed by the leading Indian expert on famines. And this argument was never actually made in the 1950s or 60s. It's a very recent thing. There was a cyclone essentially in Bengal, which destroyed grain supplies and grain stocks. Now, normally what would happen on those occasions is you would have grain imported in from nearby areas in Asia. Unfortunately, of course, the Second World War was going on and there were no routes and supplies because the Japanese were blockading the routes by which normally you would import grain. At the same time, the local administrators in Bengal proved essentially incompetent and useless in how they were distributing what few reserves there were, and they hadn't been storing stocks very well. And thirdly, and importantly, Indian tradesmen were stockpiling grain to try to increase the price of all of this. Now, all of this is happening at the height of the Second World War. We have to remember that. Churchill did all that he could to try to alleviate this. That included, at a time when Britain had serious food shortages and rationing, Churchill managed to get 1 million tons of grain to go to Bengal, getting the Australians to help in that and appealing to Canada and America. Churchill wanted to get more shipping to do that, but the Americans said they couldn't because they were planning D-Day and they needed those ships to actually take part in the D-Day landings and so forth. So there is absolutely no evidence. And again, this is all about substandard pseudo-historians who don't do primary research, coming up with these crackpot ideas, whether it be Darryl Cooper or here with the Bengal famine. The reality is, if you look at the documentary source, it's quite clear. And even the Indian leading experts know that this was not Churchill's fault. And then, of course, what else did you say? Oh, yes, poison gas. Another one we quite often hear, Churchill sanctioned the use of poison gas against the Kurds and so forth. Again, go to Churchill Archives College, and what you'll see is he's referring to tear gas. And tear gas, of course, is what is used by most police forces
Even
around the world to control mob unrest and so forth. And then, of course, with the great other one is that Churchill rolled out tanks, for example, into Glasgow to crush strikers there. Well, the reality is that there were no troops involved in violence against the rioters who were rioting in 1918-19. We had in Glasgow workers there were calling for reduced hours and so forth. There was violence between the police and the strikers. The Glasgow authorities called for backup with troops. Troops were supplied, but they didn't engage in the violence. And there were tanks that were in sheds, and the tanks never even came out of the sheds. Churchill was only Minister of War Munitions. He wasn't part of the main decision-making process. It was a Lloyd George government. He simply acceded to some demands to have troops there, but he said, let's not blow this out of proportion. It's all there in the original records, and no tanks went in. Again, this all came about in 1973 with another substandard historian wrote a book. No one had ever talked about this before 1973. Suddenly, long after everyone is dead, we get this now very popular idea in Scotland that Churchill, quote, rolled the tanks in the Battle of George Square. Complete nonsense. And I'm afraid this is what you see time and again. There are many legitimate areas to criticize Churchill. Churchill and the abdication crisis. Churchill and India. Churchill and the Dardanelles campaign in the First World War. Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer, tying Britain to the gold standard. There are many ways in which you can criticize him. He was a flawed man, as well as being the greatest prime minister we've had. But all we need to have is serious academics and historians discussing this, rather than these amateurs that we are currently seeing, unfortunately, rise to prominence on social media, which again is great. That's what free speech is all about.
Yeah, because we can have the discussion, we can have the debate. Well, look, thank you so much for decoding that. I am a big Churchill fan. I always will be. Nothing is going to change my mind on that. It doesn't mean that there aren't grey areas. Of course there are. I do completely agree with Tucker that history is not a case of black and white, but I don't think that being contrarian and trying to turn Churchill into the biggest villain of World War II helps anyone. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please do subscribe if you want lots more clips and interviews like that. Plus, if you want to watch our totally uncensored after show, then visit www.outspoken.live.